This video is sponsored by Squarespace. I'm a huge fan of Assassin's Creed. I have been for a long time. At this point, over half my life, which is insane to think about. I initially fell in love with the series with Assassin's Creed 2, and as the years went by, I started really pondering what this series was about. I thought there was a ton of potential, but it seemed as though they never really hit the nail on the head. They always just barely missed it, ricocheting off and damaging things in the process. Occasionally, they would get close to nailing it with something like Black Flag. I thought that that was a really good game. I thought that something like Assassin's Creed Unity had so much potential, and even if you play it now, you can see sparks and little elements of that potential scattered throughout. It's still pretty buggy and a little bit broken, but it's a phenomenal experience. I recommend you go back and try it if you never did. But as every subsequent release has come along, I've thought, that's predictable. It's fine, we'll see how it goes. And inevitably I'm disappointed or I'm left feeling unenthused entirely. And it was after the launch of the most recent title, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which I consider to be an absolute travesty to the franchise, to video games in general, just across the board. If you want to hear my extended thoughts, I did a 3-hour breakdown. I'm actually kind of proud of it. It's exactly 3 hours long. I have it linked below in the cards and in the description box below. Check it out if you want to hear all my thoughts on the game. I obviously went pretty in depth with it, so check that out. But it was after that game released and after I'd finished that 3-hour breakdown of the game, my mind was ringing with thoughts of Assassin's Creed. What could they have done differently? And more importantly, what can they do differently moving forward? What's an idea? What's something that could change the whole game, pun intended, and possibly save Assassin's Creed? I mean, to me at this point, you just have to break free of the mold. Everything with Ubisoft is about fitting into a mold. They have a formula that they follow. Everything is very cut and paste, drag and drop, even across titles. And once I started thinking about what they could do differently, what they could bring to the table to spark some sort of excitement within the fan base, I was taken back to a game that I played back in high school while waiting for the inevitable launch of Assassin's Creed 4, Black Flag. You know how it is. You're really excited for the launch of a new game. In this case, I was excited for Black Flag, but it was still 6 or so months away, and I had the itch. I had the Assassin's Creed itch. I needed to scratch it with something. So I started asking my friends, and one of them recommended to me a game that had released a few years before and had flown under the radar for most people. But he said it was basically Assassin's Creed in World War II. Consider me intrigued. So I did what any broke high schooler would do. I went to GameStop, I paid $5 for a copy of the game on the 360, plopped it in when I got home from school one day, and decided to give it a shot. The game was called The Saboteur, and it immediately struck me with its art style, the gameplay, the world design, and the boobs. Yes, there are boobs in this game. You actually basically are headquartered at the Moulin Rouge. I'm not gonna delve into it. You guys will just have to manage. But yes, there are boobs. So already we're starting at a 9 out of 10, right? In all seriousness, this game was really interesting. It was developed by a studio called Pandemic, which might ring a bell for some of you. They're the studio that originally did Destroy All Humans 1 and 2, and they also developed the first 2 Battlefront games, which for many of us are like the game from our youth, from our childhood. Those original Battlefront games were the shit. And crazily enough, this is the very last game they made before they went defunct on November 17th of 2009. If you want to get angry, let me spin a little tale for you real quick. Basically what happened is the Saboteur was set to launch in December 8th specifically, of 2009. The team was really excited for it. They were doing finishing touches, polishing it up, all of that good stuff. And then the studio director got a call from an executive at EA, their parent company, who informed the studio director that every single person, all 230 of the team, were losing their jobs, effective immediately. It's not really clear what happened or why it went this way, why it was so urgent that they shut everything down. But what we do know is that 228 employees were laid off and fired. A small team of around 20 to 30 people was splintered off into different studios, specifically in Los Angeles, and they were to oversee the launch of the Saboteur in the following weeks. But the core team was done. They were just gone. But setting all of that aside nicely, the Saboteur still needed to launch. And on December 8th of 2009, it did for Xbox 360, PS3, PC, and there was like an iOS version mixed with a BlackBerry version that was horrifically received. It was an awful like mobile game, but like a 2009 mobile game, so basically Pong. So we're not gonna address that in this video, but for the record, it did exist. And the game itself is pretty interesting. It's set in 1940, and we play as Sean Devlin, who is a bombastic, violent, very Irish race car mechanic. The game is set in German-occupied France, and you effectively play as one of the ringleaders of the revolution. And so, over the course of the relatively short campaign, you're going to be going through all of these missions, trying to make life living hell for all of the Nazis involved, to say it the way Churchill would. Gotta make Papa proud.
I have to leave that bit out.
And you'll do this by climbing all over buildings, racing cars around, just generally having a great time. But one of the most visually striking elements of the game's design, which you've probably already noticed just in the footage you've seen on screen to this point, is that when you are in German-occupied territory that you have not freed, everything is black and white. But when you free that territory and that area goes back under the control of the freedom-loving resistance, everything goes back to color. It's a really cool artistic choice and works surprisingly well, especially because blood still shows even in the black and white areas. It makes everything feel very dry, dark, and hopeless, and yet oddly satisfying when you get splashes of color, if you know what I mean. Even to this day, this is one of the most visually interesting games that I've ever played, and I think it's because it flows so nicely from area to area. The NPCs react differently when they're in a free area versus an occupied area, and the player begins feeling that same oppressive tone as if they were in an occupied area just by way of the color palette that's used. Of course, not actually feeling that way, but emotionally starting to sympathize, if you get what I mean. But I know what you're thinking. How does all of this tie together with Assassin's Creed and everything? Well, you see, even back when I was playing this game in high school, just to bide my time until the next Assassin's Creed game came out, I thought it did some stuff that was pretty unique and remarkable. The game had problems, certainly. Most of the systems at play here aren't as polished as you would hope to see them. Nothing is really fantastic. The free climbing, it's not as good as Assassin's Creed's was, or certainly is now, but still serviceable and good. It served the purpose. And the gunplay, also not great, but neither was the combat in Assassin's Creed 2, which launched in 2009 as well. The voice acting wasn't amazing, and the story ended on a cliffhanger, setting up a sequel, which is really awkward considering the developer didn't exist when the game launched, which is not something you can say very often. But even in spite of these shortcomings, the game feels remarkably similar to Assassin's Creed without being Assassin's Creed. And I'm going to go into detail as to why I think this game actually teaches us an important lesson about Assassin's Creed and where that franchise could go moving forward. But before we get to that, let's thank our sponsor for this video, Squarespace. Squarespace is the website hosting and design company that's for professionals and amateur users alike. Whether you're trying to open a store, just create a portfolio for your artwork, or in my case, launch a hub for a startup business, you can do it all very easily using flexible website templates that artists have already crafted for you. I actually use Squarespace to host my websites, lukestevens.net and rhapsodystream.com, both of which have individual purposes, look completely different, and have been steady and reliable since the day they launched. Check them out at squarespace.com squarespace.com/Luke Stevens to get a free trial. And when you're ready to launch your website, just use promo code Luke Stevens at checkout to save 10% off of your first purchase. Now, what makes these games similar and what makes them different? The vertical exploration by way of free climbing on the rooftops through a big historical city, something that's very notably Assassin's Creed, is core to the gameplay loop of the Saboteur. And while it's not as polished as we would see Assassin's Creed grow to be, it's still very well realized, especially for a team as inexperienced in this type of game as Pandemic. The quest structure was very similar to the type of missions we saw back in 2009 and subsequent Assassin's Creed titles, with trailing missions, stealth missions, basic combat missions. It was very 2009, don't get me wrong, but if you go back, play Assassin's Creed 2 and play the Saboteur, you'll be surprised at how well the formula translates to World War II without being a Ubisoft game. Simply put, the game feels like Assassin's Creed set in World War II, and I think it feels that way for all of the aforementioned reasons: free climbing, the combat, mission structure, that type of thing, but still feels unique. And it's interesting. It's a totally different setting than anything we've seen Assassin's Creed try to do. Sure, in Syndicate, they did flash forwards to World War I. In Assassin's Creed Unity, they have clips from World War II, things like that, but nothing really fleshed out. And the fact that they've had those flashbacks and flash forwards, flash sideways, is whatever they are, in Syndicate and Unity shows that Ubisoft has considered going to those time periods, and they've seen the actual gameplay systems play out. In Syndicate especially, where you could actually go and explore a portion of this newer London, this updated version of the world with all sorts of different vehicles to consider, weaponry and things like that. The system and formula can work in more modern settings. It's purely a matter of whether or not the development team is willing to refocus from the fantasy RPG into a more grounded, gritty, dark, historical series, which is what they did initially, but now they've kind of lost sight of it. I can't help but feel as though I'm slightly responsible for all of this, because I do have a voice on this channel, especially in the Assassin's Creed community. I know a lot of developers watch my stuff, and so I feel as though I have at least somewhat of a burden of responsibility speaking on behalf of the community to a certain extent. And when I heard Ashraf Ismail discussing the design of Assassin's Creed Origins and saying that they were going to transition towards a more focused development style, aiming for similar quest structures, world design to that of The Witcher 3. And I praised that, and I was excited about it because I love The Witcher 3. More Witcher 3? Why not? Who wouldn't want that? But what we've seen, especially with the advent of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, is that sometimes things are best left up to the studios that specialize in that type of thing. A Ubisoft version of The Witcher 3 being Valhalla just shows me I don't actually want that. And what I would much prefer is Ubisoft to refocus and try to do something a little more grounded, a little more gritty, something more historical, which is one of the things I used to love about these games. Unity, being able to explore a revolutionary France. Assassin's Creed 3, being able to go and stand beside George Washington as you're talking about how stupid Lee is. All of these things are so awesome, and as somewhat of a history buff, I love those moments, and those are some of my favorite games just because of those historical accuracies and considerations. And that's totally lost, completely lost. They've sort of given nods in Odyssey to some historical stuff, some nods in Origins to historical stuff, and then Valhalla, they just like had a seizure and fell on the floor, just didn't even consider anything. They're like, it's England, which is a place. That's it. Like, that's the extent of our historical consideration. It's just frustrating to see them go in this direction, because I think playing the Saboteur, you can see what an Assassin's Creed set in World War II could be like. The Saboteur is not the perfect game by any stretch of the imagination, but it is in effect a proof of concept that those quest structures, that world exploration style, that works in a setting like World War II. It could work. It's frustrating that we haven't seen that. If Ubisoft wants to win me over and get me going full cheerleader mode for Assassin's Creed, all they need to do is do a revamp, a refocusing where they bring it perhaps to more modern day. They could bring it to World War I for the first game in the trilogy, World War II for the second, and then they could bring it to something like Vietnam or even like set it in Russia during the Cold War or something. There are so many things they could do with more modern settings that could be so fascinating to see on the scale of what we've seen with Valhalla and Odyssey and Origins, but fully fleshed out in a more grounded, realistic setting where they have to pay certain respect to historical accuracy, which will rein them in from going crazy with minotaurs and giant smurf people like we saw in Valhalla. And I think that could lead to a game which is much better, and I think it would help the series a lot because it would restrain them. So often in these games, they go off the rails when the development team is able to just do whatever the hell they want. You know, that freedom is great, but sometimes you have to be focused. Look at Death Stranding. When Kojima goes off and does whatever the hell he wants, the game is bizarre, weird, doesn't make much sense. There's unfocused gameplay systems that contradict with other systems. It's just, it doesn't work as well. Whereas if you are focused and can narrow that attention, you can end up with something really, really cool. All of this leads me to my overarching plea to Ubisoft, which is just to consider refocusing, to consider adjusting. I know Valhalla sold very well. I know Origins and Odyssey sold very well. And there's more to this than just, as awful as it sounds, what the fans want. Often it's just what sells is the consideration. And in this case, I know it's a complicated equation, but I think Assassin's Creed in World War II could work very, very well. I think Assassin's Creed World War I could work really well, as you guys yourselves saw in those flash forward sequences in Unity and Syndicate. It could work. They just have to do it. So we'll just have to see if they have, for lack of a better term, the balls. But to wrap everything up, I do actually recommend you try the Saboteur. You can get it really cheap from a GameStop or something used, or you can go on GOG or get it on console for very cheap. And I think you will have a pleasant experience. It's not going to blow you away, but it is going to be interesting because you'll see, oh, this is basically like a 2009 Assassin's Creed set in World War II. Huh. It actually works really well. And as always, if you liked this discussion, you know what to do. If you didn't like it, you also know what to do and probably have already pressed that button, and I can't stop you. If you do want to see more content moving forward, if you want to see some of the videos I have coming out next, make sure to subscribe, ring the bell, and follow me on my social media, which I have linked in the description box below, so we can stay in touch, chill, hang out, share cute messages, whatever. But that's it for me. Thank you for watching. I love you all. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.